When I've been asked why I decided to become a minister, I always say that the primary factor was the way in which the Vietnam War radicalized me when I was a kid. My father was a World War II veteran, and though he was traumatized by his war experience, and I don't say that lightly, he stuttered and had night terrors until his death at age 92. Still, he was very proud of his service. He wasn't the kind of guy that went to military reunions or hung out at the VFW. But we discovered when my father died that he had continued to contribute really more than he could afford to all kinds of wounded veterans programs. World War II was thought of when I was a kid as the good war. I'm sure no one in my rural Kentucky town ever questioned how the United States embargo against shipping metals to Japan, which slowed their industrialization, might have actually caused their attack on Pearl Harbor. But in my southern Kentucky context, such things as causes or reasons were not considered. They just flew across the ocean and attacked Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, because my father's generation had been convinced that World War II was the Great War, they tended to credit every military action that took place afterwards as sending our armies to defend our freedom, to fight for liberty. Just as no one in Glasgow, Kentucky, talked about our embargo of industrial supplies to Japan, creating the tensions that led to our war with them, they certainly knew nothing about how we got involved in Vietnam in the first place, taking over the defense of a French colony that was at the time the world's leading source of natural rubber, which was still used in the growing automobile industry. I don't recall anything ever even being said about this issue in any news reports of the day. We were in Vietnam, we were told by our government's propaganda to stop the spread of communism in something that was called the domino theory. And it was obvious to me, even as a 14-year-old high school student in rural Kentucky, where I have told you before, the zip code really was EIEIO, that was a completely bogus excuse for the war. I did read books written by imprisoned draft resistors that I suspect our school librarian did not even know were on the shelves of our high school library. I was convinced that our involvement in that war was wrong, that it was morally wrong. And the only way that I had of expressing my objections that wouldn't get me kicked out of my own home for being a communist sympathizer was to express my objections in religious terms, because we were a church-going family. I rehearsed those speeches so many times through high school and the early years of college life that really I couldn't have ended up anywhere but seminary. In those days, I wanted to think of myself as being a religious pacifist. Certainly Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. had championed nonviolent resistance in something like the voice of pacifism. Martin Luther King very clearly insisted that the suffering of Black Americans had nothing to do with anything they were doing in Vietnam, and he insisted that our country begin to realign its priorities. But it deserves to be asked, are there good and just causes for a nation to go to war, especially in the 21st century in the presence of nuclear arms? Certainly, repelling an invasion on the face of it is justified. But what about stopping a genocide or a Holocaust happening in another country? Even if our own country is not in any way threatened, would it be noble for us to get involved in a humanitarian crisis? For centuries, philosophers and kings have offered their own just war theories. Augustine actually spoke to this issue voluminously, but it was St. Thomas Aquinas who took Augustine's work and formalized it into a statement of the conditions of what would make a war a just war. His work has stood the test of time pretty well, especially in Catholic circles. He says that, first, a war must be waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign. That is, it can't be a terrorist event. It can't be a rogue rebellion of some kind. Only a government can legitimately declare war on another government. Secondly, the war needs to be waged for a just cause. That is, it can't be to go and rob the resources or take the land of a neighbor. It had to be in response to something that had been done wrong that needed to be corrected. So that limits a country really pretty much to either self-defense or a humanitarian attempt to stop an egregious Holocaust or human rights violation. Thirdly, St. Thomas says that the warriors themselves, those that go to war, must have right intent to promote good and not evil. Because even when it seems like we're going to war for the right reasons, soldiers oftentimes will behave very badly, adding rape or torture or murder and robbery to the battlefield. St. Thomas envisioned an army of noble soldiers. Now, I'm not a historian, but I don't think there are many just wars that have ever been fought in the history of the world if we take St. Thomas seriously, because none of this is simple, and the real causes of war are never black and white, and those who engage in warfare are never entirely pure. We understand that bombings by citizens in Northern Ireland are in protest of British rule. But would we be sympathetic if Native Americans began to set off bombs in American cities in protest of the Europeans' invasion and genocide of the Indian populations in North America? Now, in current times, we have objected very strongly to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, particularly with the war crimes against civilians that we are hearing about. But there's a lot of history between Ukraine and Russia. Russia historically got its start in what is now the Ukraine, and the borders have changed many times over the centuries. There are parts of Ukraine where Russian is the dominant language, and the majority of the population may actually prefer to be a part of Russia. When do boundaries become permanent? What is legitimate territorial reclamation, and what is invasion and occupation? Does, for example, the state of Israel have a right to claim the West Bank? Because possibly during the time of King David, it was a Jewish-controlled part of the kingdom. What about the people, though, who have lived in that real estate for 2,000 years? People who don't think that the Hebrew Scriptures are telling the truth when it says that God promised this particular piece of real estate to another ethnic group. Now, because I would like to be a pacifist, I would like to be able to Rodney King the whole issue of modern warfare and just say, why can't we all just get along? But it is never that simple. Those of you who followed my work for a while will recognize the name of the famous World War I general, Smedley Butler, who wrote the book, War is a Racket. It's a very short book, but I can't recommend it enough. It's worth your time. And when I say your time, I mean only about 30 minutes to read the whole thing. But Butler was convinced that nearly all wars ended up being, whether they started that way or not, but they end up being an excuse to transfer wealth and power into the hands of a very few people, and that the soldiers are just being exploited for the purpose of getting money into the hands of the already wealthy. And among the poor, it costs them their lives, or at least it costs them their limbs, or as in my father's case, it costs them their peace of mind for the rest of their lives. Butler proposed an amendment to the Constitution that I think if we put it to a popular vote, it would probably pass in an afternoon. His amendment proposed that our soldiers could never be sent off of American soil, unless, of course, they were defending the Panama Canal. He made a carve-out there. His proposed amendment would limit our Navy to sailing no more than 500 miles from our shores, and our Air Force, he said, should never stray more than 750 miles from American territory. This adamant, non-interventionist position sure could have saved us a lot of lives and a whole lot of money over the past century. And I have to think that most American citizens, voters in particular, would absolutely love it. But folks, is it just for a nation of our size with our power to take a hands-off approach to the rest of the world? Is that, in and of itself, just? This is especially significant in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To put this conflict into context, let me remind you that when the Soviet Union was falling apart, NATO countries were legitimately concerned about how reliable some of those Eastern European countries were going to be, not only to govern themselves, but to sensibly manage the nuclear arsenals that just happened to be located on their land. It had been Soviet government that controlled them, but when the Ukraine became independent, it had the largest nuclear arsenal in the world on its real estate. Russia and NATO powers worked together to persuade the Ukraine to then give up this nuclear arsenal and to base their giving that up on the promise of the West that they would always come to their aid if they needed to be protected. And Russia was assured that the NATO forces would never try to recruit Ukraine or other Eastern European countries into NATO, moving NATO threateningly closer and closer to Russia's borders. And you know, that set of circumstances, those agreements, actually worked pretty well for about 30 years. However, in 2014, when Russia decided to annex the Crimea, we didn't do anything to protect the Ukraine. I don't know that we've ever gotten an honest account of that failure, but I suspect that from President Obama's perspective and other Western European countries, that Crimea was sort of Russia anyway, and its acquisition made sense for Russia to be able to ship oil and gas through gas lines. And who are we really to object to military action to defend economic interest? You have to admit, we've done it a lot. But early in February of 2022, when Russia was positioning troops on the border with Ukraine, I thought it was a bluff. I was wrong, but I thought it was a bluff. In fact, I remember saying at the time that Putin was chest thumping because we had, in fact, been working trying to get NATO influence closer and closer to Russia's borders, and they had reason to object to that. I even remember telling people that Putin wasn't crazy, that he had some justifiable reason for doing this chest thumping. So I thought it was a threat only to send a signal to the West. Evidently, President Volodymyr Zelensky thought so too, because he literally made fun of President Biden for making so many public warnings about an imminent Russian invasion. Clearly, American intelligence was better than Ukrainian intelligence, and it was better than mine, because Biden was right and President Zelensky and I were wrong. However, Putin did not want to just warn the Ukraine about getting too close to NATO. He intended to annex the whole country and end the debate. And in so doing, Nixon's old domino theory excuse for war started to look kind of plausible. In February of 2020, I thought Putin had very rational reasons for concern, but I have not been able to use the word rational in reference to Putin since that time, because his conduct of the war has been completely irrational. But war is never black and white. There's never just a good side and a bad side. However, when we start to wonder what makes up a just war, Putin's Russia has made this war appear to be about as black and white as modern warfare can be. In 1989, when the Soviet Union was disintegrating, my old college roommate, Alan, went to the Army Language Training Center in California because Alan believed that after the United States Army paid him for 2 years to study Russian, that he would then be able to get a job with one of the many industries that were moving into Russia as Russia was opening itself to foreign investment. Now, about that same time, 1989, was when I adopted my daughter from Korea, and my daughter was among the very last of infants that were adopted out of Korea into the West. So I assumed that my second child would also probably come from Russia. But corruption in Russia made Western businesses pull out almost as quickly as they had rushed to move in. And then many parents who attempted to adopt out of Russia found themselves being asked over and over and over again for bribe after bribe after bribe, so that adoption out of Russia became so exorbitantly expensive and entirely unreliable that people just stopped trying. Russia went from being a corrupt communist government into being a corrupt oligarchy, ruled by oligarchs who had become rich largely through government contracts, bribes, and corruption. Ukraine was similarly famous for the same kind of corruption. In fact, my first introduction to Volodymyr Zelensky was when he was described as being Eastern Europe's Jon Stewart. He was a comedian who had a TV show making fun of the corruption in the Ukrainian government. And he played a corruption-fighting president on this TV comedy show before he became so popular that he was actually recruited into politics and was elected to become a real-life corruption-fighting president in Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to stake my reputation on this, but I really don't know how much progress Volodymyr was making in fighting corruption until Russia invaded a year and a half ago. And that's when everything got real. Most Western leaders didn't take Zelensky very seriously at first until history turned a comedian into the kind of leader that the Ukraine really needed. Now, mind you, our media likes to keep things simple, so they mostly describe this conflict in colors of black and white, and in our media's version, Zelensky is always the hero. But war is dirty business, and there is no way to fight a war and remain entirely morally pure. And Putin's allegations of Ukrainian government corruption and of literal Nazi influence in some regions of the Ukraine were not entirely false. He had a point, but it's not like you can say being taken over by Russia would not make matters much worse in both issues of racism and corruption. To get and keep military and financial support from the United States and the rest of NATO, Ukraine has been having to clean up its act very aggressively. Although, to be honest, some of those Nazi-influenced soldiers seem to be pretty good at fighting, and so we kind of turn our heads and look the other way when a part of the Ukrainian army really is anti-Semitic. Were it not for the support from NATO countries, Ukraine wouldn't have survived more than a few weeks of this war. And sadly, if Trump had won the last election, he would not likely have done anything to thwart Putin's plans on taking over the whole country. So for whatever reason, be it sympathy or blackmail, Trump has never yet stood up to Putin, and we have no reason to believe he ever would. So now we have an election coming up in just over a year that is more important to the people living in Ukraine than any election that's actually going to take place in Ukraine. President Biden has been the glue that brought NATO together in support of the Ukraine, but without him, I don't know if that coalition of NATO forces would hold on to their unity. If Trump is elected next November, then the Ukraine will probably fall into Russia's hands. And frankly, things wouldn't look too good for Poland either. A lot of religious people are so opposed to war that they have been calling for immediate negotiations with Russia, even if it means giving up big pieces of the Ukraine to bring an end to the war. I frankly tend to share General Smedley Butler's cynicism about almost all wars. Even when there is just cause for conflict, that doesn't keep war profiteers from getting involved to fleece the country. In fact, though I said it tongue-in-cheek, I've often said that I am so opposed to military action that I'm already against the next war, wherever it will be fought. But now I think we have to take a more sober view of what it means to enter a just war, even if, because of the nuclear potential of getting involved, the United States has to continue to make this a proxy war in which no American soldiers are at risk. In the early 20th century, General Butler made an exception for his interventionist views in the case of the Panama Canal, because the Panama Canal was crucial to world trade, especially regarding the shipment of food. The longer some foods are in the hold of a ship, the more of it gets lost to spoilage, to vermin. So I see why General Butler made an exception in that case. But the world of the early 21st century is even more interconnected than anything Butler could have imagined. For example, Russia is blocking sea traffic in Ukraine's Black Sea ports. That's not hard to understand since the Ukraine is being resupplied with ammunition and war-related hardware through those same ports. But the Ukraine is also a major exporter of grain, most of which goes to the poorest countries in the Middle East and in Africa. That creates an economic hardship for Ukrainian farmers and a humanitarian crisis, especially in Africa. But that loss of grain on the world market also makes the price of my Cheerios go up dramatically, and inflation in the United States always affects the poor and the most at-risk people the most. We're trying to embargo Russia's oil and gas to cut off their ability to fund their illegal war, but that drives up the price of heating oil all over Europe and threatens the energy needs of industry in both India and China. Still, this level of global destabilization, is it sufficient for us to continue to fund and supply a prolonged war, giving Ukraine the sophisticated and powerful weapons that keep them in the fight? When Russia took over Crimea and the rest of the world stood idly by and just watched, There were 6 deaths. The entire invasion of Crimea only resulted in 6 casualties, and 3 of them were people that were leading protests. They weren't soldiers. 6 people. But compare that with the casualty count in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. At this point, we estimate that 250,000 Russians have been killed and more than 130,000 Ukrainians. And it's important to note that the overwhelming majority of these deaths on both sides have been civilians. Only a fraction of those who have died while they were engaged in battle. The war is nowhere near being over, and yet as of this recording, 400,000 people have died. What justifies this? What could possibly justify that level of death? If I could believe that the rumors are true and that Putin is gravely ill and will be dead soon, then maybe that would be a good reason to continue the fight. But if I could believe that he really would settle for holding on to some part of the Ukraine as an additional buffer against NATO and then stop fighting, even I might be inclined to trade some real estate for an end to the bloodshed. But of course, that's not my decision to make. It's Americans' decision to make whether we're going to continue to financially and hardware-wise support the war effort, but it is not our decision to make to decide how much of the Ukraine might be given away in exchange for peace. So I'm not going to conclude this sermon in the way that I have so many of my previous sermons, saying that's just my opinion, I just so happen to be right. This is, however, just my opinion, but I know I could be wrong. Here are the things which I believe that spiritual persons, people who have a social conscience, should consider. First, this is undoubtedly a proxy war in which NATO is willing to fund the Ukrainian military so that they fight a war to weaken Russia that we couldn't possibly fight ourselves without starting a nuclear conflict that could possibly end the world. Secondly, the cost of this war is not just the lives of brave Ukrainians, but it's also draining the finances of the USA and many European countries, so that this war's real cost should be seen as health care we don't provide to millions and millions of poor people. It should be seen as the public housing projects that never get built, the schools, the fire stations, the renewable energy resources that just don't happen because we are spending the money on the war between Ukraine and Russia. We are buying bombs and bullets and airplanes and tanks, not schools, not hospitals, not new transportation or repairing old bridges. Thirdly, I will offer this. If Putin is not near death, any concession we make to him now will make every other country in Eastern Europe less safe. I was wrong to believe that Putin wouldn't really invade the Ukraine, and I don't think that the rest of the world should be at all cavalier about the fact that Putin is a 21st century version of Adolf Hitler who must be stopped, even though stopping him comes at a very high financial price. Placating tyrants always ends up costing more than it would cost to stop their empire-building delusions, which, though no one asked me, this is why I think it's important for Donald Trump to spend time in jail for his many crimes. Democracy itself is not safe if we allow a tyrant like Trump to get away with leading an insurrection and trying to set aside our Constitution and ignore the results of a free and fair election. But that observation is for free, and it isn't really related to this sermon topic. The corporations that manufacture bombs, bullets, airplanes, and tanks are getting rich off of this war, even though we really want to resupply the beleaguered Ukrainian army. The military-industrial complex is still who they are, and they win no matter which country is involved in the war and no matter which country wins the war. Those corporations always win when people fight. In that sense, General Smedley Butler is 100% right. We should avoid military conflict in virtually every instance, except for those times when failing to take up arms causes much more suffering than the more satisfying pacifistic response. Nonviolent protest is always best, except for when it isn't. War is never black or white. There is no such thing as a good war or a great war, but some causes are more than just a dogmatic neutrality. As Elie Wiesel said, neutrality always serves the oppressor and never the oppressed. There are times that we cannot be just and neutral at the same time. So it is my belief that it would be wrong to remain neutral in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I have chosen a side. And even as a post-theistic pastor, when I say I've chosen a side in a war, it seems right to say, God help us. From the founding of our church, our motto has always been, thou shalt not stand idly by. To choose to sit this one out is to give aid and encouragement to the tyrants who cause death and suffering all over the world. And that, my friends, is not our portion.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.